So, of course, there are many laboratory examinations, but the key question is which are really scientifically proven and sound. And that is quite a big issue because all the time new tests are developed and very much promoted and things like that. And then it is repeated by other researchers and it turned out to be maybe not so reliable as you think. And certainly one of the big problems is it really clinical applicable? So that's a difference between research, etc. So many tests have been developed, and I think I spent maybe 70% of my career in proving that tests didn't work. So all kinds of negative publications with a positive attitude, of course, but yeah, it's like that. Not many survived the time, you know, if you look all over the day and over the time and you ask people, what do you think about know them? Or some researcher starts to invent something new, which is not new. That's also useful to know. Be critical, understand what you are doing. Many people apply certain tests without really knowing what they precisely are measuring. It's some kind of black box, especially for, medical doctors with this situation, that they just apply it like that and they have no idea what's precisely happening. Come back to that in detail. So be critical and do not accept common opinions. Use your brains. That is most important. Okay, let's start. Now, first, balance, posture, and gait. This is typical a topic where there's a lot of mystery, a lot of kind of tests that you can do, all kinds of fantastic machines, and you look at them, and, wow, this is really amazing, beautiful colored pictures, etc. But what is it measuring, and what is it really useful for the clinic? The most simple test is, of course, the Romberg or associated postural balance test. There are many. You have the Fukuda, you have the Babinski-Wall. That already is a warning. If you have so many tests and they still all exist and are executed, it means that there's not one test that's apparently really very good. So the basic idea with the Romberg is that you ask a person to stand still as good as possible, and you compare that with standing on foam rubber to manipulate somatosenses and to close the eyes and open the eyes so that you can weight the contribution of vision somatosenses best way. To say it in very few words, I think generally if you do this test just on the ground with eyes open or eyes closed, I think the vast majority of people can do that without any problem. So it's not a very sensitive test. It starts to become sensitive when you compromise somatosenses. So when you put them on foam rubber or you ask people to stand in tandem, and then especially with eyes closed. This the last condition, condition 4, with foam rubber, eyes closed, that is for people with vascular deficit, extremely difficult. Problem there is, of course, that age plays also an important role. The older you become, the more problematic it becomes, so you get a lot of false negatives, false positives. Now, you can, of course, measure things. So you can observe it. If people can stand for 10 or 30 seconds like that and use that as a criterion, or you can really measure things. You can use force platforms, or you can use sensors. You can, of course, markers with videos. You can put accelerometers on the different parts of the body, and then you can analyze the movement of the body as well. Okay, and then you get typical pictures, statokinesograms or posterographic evaluations, whatever name you give it, and you can calculate many parameters here. So the sway path, how you are moving exactly, the surface, the area. There are all kinds of different kind of calculations, and there is no absolute golden standard. So if you are going to different literature, you will find that people use different measures in a different way. That's already a warning that apparently maybe at a certain moment the machines can be bought commercially. But if you go into the software and look what has been analyzed there, you will find that there are quite different things. So that makes it difficult. So as soon as you start to do this, very well think about what you want to analyze, how and which outcome parameters you are going to use. It's not something that is so simple as sometimes is suggested. And you can find it out by looking at the literature and comparing how people have done it precisely, and you will see the differences. There's a whole school, especially in France. Postrography is very popular in France, and they have so many companies making all kinds of machines. It's amazing, and the one is even more beautiful than the other. So one of the best platforms is now coming from France. Yeah, okay, whatever. Now, as you can see, you can measure the hip angle, the ankle angle, center of mass, and one of the things that has been developed already 30, 40 years was a whole theory about ankle and hip strategy, that you can compare that and see differences in different kinds of pathologies. I'm not going into all the details of the things, but you can see that here it is much more wider distributed than before. This one was the normal data, and this is the patient with a bilateral vascular loss, and you see much more sway and movement. And of course, there is a criterion where you can say this is abnormal, this is normal. There's quite some overlap between people with normal vascular function, people with bilateral vascular function. Okay, so then, because this stabilometry static evaluation didn't work very well in the clinic, people start to say, okay, it's the same as with EEG. When you just record EEG, it's not very specific. But now you give a stimulus, and then you look at the change of EEG. And that is more specific. And this is the same story. So basically, you give a stimulus that can be that the platform suddenly starts to move, or you let the environment move. So all kinds of tricks and measures to do that. And the golden standard became what we call the EQI test, which was FDA approved, big commercial success. And it started to become used as a tool to discriminate between patients that are more influenced by vascular, somatosensory, or visual information. It turns out that there's so much variability and that every individual has his own strategy, which can change, by the way, also when you measure a second day. So that puts a big question mark how strong this is for diagnostic purposes. So it's predominantly used for evaluation of balance training. So to see if the performance improves when you do a certain training in these patients. That's worthwhile. All these tests, you can say that they don't have a clear diagnostic value, so they are more tests of functionality. So they're useful for that because you can document things, etc. And that's the major application of these tests. It's not so much used anymore for understanding how the strategies and things are organized among patients. Now, then, of course, gait analysis. The sky is the limit. So this is the current system that you will see also today. Maybe, okay, because it's a big multi-million-dollar system where with cameras you can precisely analyze the movement with markers. You have mobile EMG. You can see which muscles are activated. You can manipulate the environment completely. So this is the top of the bill in terms of money also. And you need to have a technician to do that. And this is a real tool that is used by physiotherapists and motion analysis people and biomechanical people to study motor behavior in patients when walking. This is one of the tools that we also use to study the movement pattern in bilateral vascular arteroflexia patients. How different is it? But you can imagine this is not the standard equipment that people will have. I don't know how many there are, maybe 10 or 20 in the world, something like that. So then we come back to what can you do in a simple clinical setup. And then this modified test of balance, sensory input of balance, is still to some extent the golden standard. So that is the first test that you saw. person standing with eyes open firm, eyes closed firm, eyes open on phone, and then eyes closed on phone. And you record how long people can stand. And then you have for different categories of age, you have the criteria. And this test, especially condition 4, is extremely sensitive for identifying patients with severe bilateral vestibular loss, with a big stripe under severe. So modest losses you will not pick up like that. Another test that is used very often to evaluate balance and motility is the timed up and gait and go test. So basically a person is sitting and 3 meters ahead, and you ask the patient go up and walk 3 meters like that, turn around, come back like that, and sit down. And then the criterion is very simple. Can you do that within 12 seconds? If it's more than 12 seconds, there is something wrong. It doesn't tell you what is wrong, but at least that is not normal. Okay, that is a very often used in the physiotherapy, etc. If you look at gait analysis, of course you have these machines, but many people don't have them. So you can be very pragmatic and say, okay, what is the most accepted test of gait? That's the functional gait analysis, or the dynamic gait index, things like that. They are very similar. Basically what you do is you ask a person to walk over a path of about 6 meters, and you have all kinds of different conditions. As you can see, people have to move their head while they're walking, or close their eyes while walking, getting distracted one or the other way, and you score every condition with a score from 0 to 3. There's a very precise definition of how to score that. And then you accumulate, you sum up the scores, and the ultimate score tells you whether this is normal or abnormal. And then you can do a therapy and see if it improves. Okay. So another thing that is very important is that you're smiling. Why?
I was thinking of how we could, the reflex that we do in rats, which is also basically polymorph.
Here you are. So, so you have all kinds of tests that has been developed, of course, to study fall sensitivity for falls and prediction, etc. The whole story by itself. But this is what we call then the perturbation built test, where you can train people to prevent falls. And of course, you can use that also to diagnose whether people are at risk for falling. So there are all kinds of specific conditions, and you can find that on the, I just mentioned it, oh, well, I will send you the reference if you need it. But basically, a person are walking and suddenly there's a disturbance, and you look at how they are behaving, and you learn them, you train them how to prevent the fall. Key point here is that if you do normal rehab, it apparently doesn't help a lot in prevention of falls. But this, that is specifically focused on prevention of falls, seems to be very helpful. This is emerging research. Okay. So fall and diagnostic trainings, and here, oh, you see here the reference from Chris McCrum. It's interesting. Now we're going to measure eye movements, because via the vestibular ocular reflex, we can see how the vestibular system functions. We always say that the eyes are the window to the vestibular system. Okay, now the sky is the limit in terms of methods. And you will see that we in Maastricht still use the old-fashioned electro-oculography. And many people don't use it anymore. They think it's obsolete, it's crazy, it's easy with the camera, etc. As a physicist, I can tell you that's really bullshit, because the EOG is always working almost. Whereas the video eye tracking has all kinds of issues, come back to that later. It has some advantages, of course, but if you say, no, never do EOG, then you make a fundamental mistake. Nowadays, we have more and more video eye trackers that can also measure eye torsion, although there is a lot of discussion about it. If you can measure eye torsion, yeah, then it's an extra plus compared to the EOG, because that is only horizontal and vertical. Okay, basically, the golden standard of eye movement recording is the magnetic scale color technique. You put a contact lens in the eye. In the contact lens is a copper wire, wired in a very special way, and you put a magnetic field around the patient. So you measure then the induction, the current in the coil. So as soon as the coil starts to move, or the eye starts to move, you can see a change of eye movement. This apparatus we also have here in Maastricht. We have everything always. So this is something that we use to calibrate and verify systems. But this is not clinically very acceptable. I used it on myself many times, but it's not pleasant. You can wear it maybe 20 minutes and then you have to recover sometimes. So, okay, so that is research. A few years later, there were all kinds of techniques to measure the pupil position. There are all kinds of different techniques. And slowly they developed into more very nice, elegant devices that you can wear as glasses. Fundamentally, of course, the point is, can you track the pupil? And if you want to talk about torsion, can you track the rotation of the iris? Okay. So you do that because you want to measure the eye movements for all kinds of tests that are typical to identify deficits in the vestibular system, nystagmus in certain conditions, and visual-induced eye movement to see if the visual system works properly, and also for neurological issues, because very often many neurological problems are first seen in the oculomotor deficits. It's a very sensitive measure. So there's a desk to do that in a proper way. Now, if you turn now to the vestibular system, can you use these eye movements for measuring vestibular function? The answer is yes. And it depends on what you want to know from this curve. I told you yesterday, or the day before yesterday, that there's a frequency dependence of the canals. And also all these tests that we do, the caloric test, the rotary chair test, and the head impulse test, have a different frequency content. So it means that if you want to test the low frequency function of the canals, you use the caloric test, with the restriction that the caloric test only tells you something about the horizontal canals. And the torsion is something that you can do in 3 dimensions. So basically, it's in the middle frequencies. And the high frequencies, that is very close to the normal physiological movements, is in the high frequencies. The head impulse test is, of course, a test that is a passive movement. So I do the movement. Whereas in normal daily life, you always have active movements, almost. So there's also a fundamental difference in active and passive movements, how it is wired in brain, etc. That's why I say to you always, keep thinking what you're doing. So this is so important. So the clinical head impulse test, and we have video head impulse test. The first results were described about the clinical head impulse test, but very fast devices were developed to measure the eye movements with head impulse test systems. Now here, from a point of physics, you immediately will say, wow, are you stupid to do this like that? Because with every movement, the inertia of mass will act upon the glasses. So it will be very difficult to keep the glasses stabilized on the head. In fact, the only way you can do that, if you want to improve it, is make a mechanical connection between the glasses and put it in a bite body. I did a lot of research in that area, and that's the only way that you're pretty sure that the glasses will not move relative to the head. Because if the glasses move to the head, then the key question is it the eye movement or the head movement that you're detecting? Okay, so they're fantastic, but one of the issues is how stable is it? It's a slippage. Now, if you look at the head impulse test in a normal subject, you can see what is happening. You will see the velocity of the eye and the head displayed in the same direction, but they are in the opposite direction. And the device from Autometrics or Natus nowadays, you can see that they are plotted in a, you have an easy comparison of the eye movement. but in reality, they are in the opposite direction. And you see perfectly move in the opposite direction with the same shape. There's a small change in a difference in amplitude. And if very accurately, you will see that there is a small latency, of course, but that's only 8 milliseconds. So that's not something scale. So an example of a normal video head impulse test is you make a fast movement, and then you see that there's a movement of the head in one direction, a movement of the eye in the other direction. So in this software, it's not inverted. And you can see that the critical thing is, of course, are you able to keep on tracking the pupil correctly? And are the glasses really the goggles on the head? So all kinds of possible. So if you do the head impulse test with a patient with a bilateral vestibular loss, this is what you in principle can see. So you have the head movement and the eyes come later with correction saccades. So there's no, if you look in the slow, you see here that during the movement, the eyes are not moving. So they are too late. And in the slow motion, you see it very well. So now the eye movement comes, whereas it should immediately start to move with the head movement. So I make the head movement like normally my eyes move in the opposite direction. But here in the bilateral loss patient, the patient's gaze moves with the head and then make a correction. So it comes too late, and that is the correction saccade is what you see there. Now, this is an example of a patient normal. So you see this defective head impulse. You see not enough, and there's a correction saccades to be sure that the patients are looking at the right target. So the instruction of the patient is look straight forward, fixation point, keep on looking at that, and then they fail. You understand? You look there. Okay. And here you can see an example that it's difficult to calculate the response. Because, yeah, when it's normal, it's easy. You compare this velocity with that velocity. That is the gain, amplification. But here, yeah, okay, it's relatively easy because there is no activity here. So you can compare it, easy to calculate. You see that there's a very low gain here. But if you have a patient with a deficit with all kinds of saccades that can occur during the head movements, then it's a bit more difficult. You will see that in a moment. So here you see what is happening in many patients. So they make the movement, it is impaired, but during the head movement, they already start to make saccades because they have learned to respond much faster. And that's terrible because if you want to calculate now what the gain is, then it's more difficult to define good parameter. That's what you see here. So what is the gain here? Are you measuring here or there or there or there? That's why people started to develop all other algorithms to improve the reliability of the head impulse. And so this is a problem in calculating the gain. So you can also calculate things by looking at just if these correction saccades are happening always at the same time. Here you can see a patient with a very recent lesion. So there's all kinds of activity. And here the activity is clustered. So apparently the brain has learned how to generate the saccades in a very structurized way. So this patient has a deficit, but it's more compensated, more adapted than the patient here. These are all examples. You don't need to memorize it, just to create awareness that there are different ways of calculating things. You do not become an expert in head impulse test just in 5 minutes. It's not something like that. Okay, now another issue is that you can maybe measure also the vertical canal. So this is horizontal. And vertical is around the entry and posterior canal. So you have to make a very specific head movement. And there's an issue here, because if I look at you and I move my head like that, I have a pure vertical movement. But if I do the test like this, stimulate the same canals, I do not only have a vertical movement, but also a rotatory eye. And most eye trackers do not detect a rotation. So then it seems as if the gain is too low, because a part of the energy, the response, is in the rotatory component, which is not detected. So that's why you have to do everything in precisely the exact way. The only way to do it is to rotate the head like that and ask the patient to look in the same plane so that the eye movement is pure vertical and can be detected. Okay, so this is the right way to do it. So, and then, you want to calculate those gains. And as I told you, it's sometimes difficult to do. Now, to overcome that problem, that you have all these facades during the head movements, they invented the SHIMP. That is the suppression head impulse test. Or originally, the test was called head impulse test, HIT. If you do then the suppressed head impulse test, the abbreviation would be SHIT. They didn't like that, so they changed everything into HIMP and SHIMP and VIMP, whatever. So that's the reason why it is SHIMP. Now, how does it work? Basically, so you make a movement, and in the glasses is a small laser which is projecting on the wall. So now the instruction is not to look at the fixed target, but to the moving target. But because it's projected in front of you, basically you follow automatically that target. Now, the problem is that if you have a vestibular ocular reflex, you make the movement, but your reflex brings the eyes in the opposite direction. So you're not able, normally, a healthy person, to keep on looking at the target because you have this reflex. If you have no labyrinths, then you just follow the target because you have no compensatory eye movement. So the advantage there is that in a healthy people, okay, you have this correction saccade, but in a people with deficits, you have no correction saccades. So you have a flat curve and you can perfectly calculate the gain. So here you can see a normal subject. He's too late to make the movement. He's fixating the target. And then he makes a correction saccade. If you look at a normal participant, then you have the SHIMP and the HIMP. So, and they show basically the same curve of the gain. But if there are correction saccades in the SHIMP, they will always come at the end of the movement. So they don't do the thing. Now let's have a look at the unilateral vestibular loss patient with SHIMPs, overt saccades. And then you can see that when you go to the bad side, there's no correction saccade. And there's a perfectly gain that you can calculate. And to the healthy side, you see perfectly gain. So the SHIMP is a trick to overcome the problem of calculation. And did a lot of research also here in Maastricht, comparing the clinical usefulness of the SHIMP. And Raymond can tell you everything about it. So that's next question.
I wanted to know if in the SHIMP paradigm, the vertical saccades are as free as the horizontal, because they are the oculomotor extension that is less possible. I don't know if I made sense.
You mean a vertical correction saccade?
Yeah, because you are.
You mean in the vertical SHIMP?
Yeah.
So I think normally it works the same, but I think it's extremely difficult to measure that because it's.
As you said before, there is this in the
right angle.
case, yeah, you have the intrusion of the vestibular information that makes you difficult to keep an eye on. So I was wondering if it was supportable or comfortable for the patient to do the test, and that this intrusion of the vestibular correction normally is not impairing the shape and making fake noise.
To be honest, I'm not very into the shape in the vertical plane. Do you have
So
Raymond?
I don't know.
And it's not comfortable to play in this way
Yeah.
when you do the hit in general setting. So using the tracker to follow is not comfortable now. So I was wondering if there were not extra noise in the vertical shape paradigm due to this position.
So the question is, if vertical plane doing shimps is actually a problem?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the same as for any vertical. Actually, shimp is a head impulse test, but any head impulse test in the vertical plane gives you trouble, to be honest.
The fact that we need to pursue these targets is not more complicated than just keeping an eye on it. That's my question.
The difference between the vertical hint and the shin vertical. So is the instruction to fixate the target that is on the wall not easier than if you really have to fixate it while it's moving with you?
Thank you.
Okay, this is, that would be, to be honest, the vertical shimp we haven't tried. The reason is also that if you look from clinical consequence, horizontal head impulse test is always easier than the vertical, and it has to do mainly also with the pupil tracking. Because pupil tracking in the vertical plane is quite challenging, so often in the way, etc. And also from a clinical point of view, that the horizontal canal is often a very good reflection of the whole vestibular system. And often you see when the horizontal canal is abnormal, that the other canals might also be abnormal. And while isolated vertical canals are way less common, you know. So therefore, if you're interested in, let's say, from a clinical point of view, the status of the vestibular organ, we would always advise to first perform a horizontal head impulse test and then add the vertical ones. And therefore, let's say, if the background of your question is maybe, I'm not sure, can you replace the horizontal by the vertical because it's easier or not? And we would not suggest it. So actually, if you want to do verticals, always have to do horizontal.
Yeah.
But I will be happy to go into the details, I think later, but I then don't think we have time to go into all the. No, it's a very good question. Because the problem is a little bit that the head impulse tests are very often promoted as easy and everybody can do it. That's absolutely nonsense. It's not easy at all. So it's complicated. And here you can see an attempt from Zuma from Brazil, close friend, who did like glasses with a fixating point moving with the head to see if in a clinical way you can also assess the shape. And in a second, I will record it again. And if you look carefully, I'm a normal person, at least that is what I say. Then, if you look at the eyes, then you will see that I make a clear correction saccade. Come on. You see? And of course, this is not honest because I'm doing it myself. It's an active test. It's not a very good example, but it shows you what happens even in an active test. So one of the biggest problems with video head impulse test is the imaging of the pupil. When you are looking at people from China or Japan, where there is not a lot of space in the vertical plane for the detection of the pupil, you are in trouble. And also elderly with drooping eyelids, all kinds of things. So it's not, when you are a beautiful girl from Brazil, where you have these nice open eyes, and then you do a head impulse test. Yes, it's fantastic. And you will always see these examples. but the reality is different. And if you move the head, as you can see, here's one of our technicians, slow motion, you see everything moves. So don't have the idea that it's easy to fixate something on the head, because everything is amazing. So, okay. Okay, so what is the strategy? Identify artifacts, evaluate non-artifact eye movements, and evaluate the response, including gain, all kinds of things. So the whole protocol to do it. And the key point is always look at the raw data. Don't trust the diagrams with results with only the gain and things like that. Look at the raw data. There's also a way that you can do it with a mobile phone. So here you can see she's holding the phone, that's my daughter, and we make a very fast movement, and then you record that. But fortunately, with the mobile phone, you can image it with a slow motion. And then you can see perfectly whether it's normal or not normal, even in the vertical plane. So, but of course, it's qualitative. And to be honest, it's mostly clear, the abnormalities, when you have severe vascular loss. Example, this is a lady in Aalborg. I used just normal daylight, so the patient is sitting looking outside, and you see the correction saccade. So I make the movement of the head, and then you see that the eyes move with the head, and then she makes the correction. And that is in both directions. So this is a clear bilateral vascular. And then I developed the technique where you just use a vlogging unit. So to have a nice illumination that improves the signal to noise ratio of the images. And you can see this is a normal person in slow motion recording, and you see a perfect stabilization of the eyes. So you can use the reflections as a reference. See? So your patient will be a clear deficit. No discussion about it, whether this is abnormal. And now I will show you that if you look more careful to, she doesn't only has this head impulse as abnormal, but if you ask her to look a little bit to the right and to the left, she has a clear gaze evoked nystagmus. So this is a combined central peripheral problem. This is a canvas. Okay, so conclusions. VHIT, fantastic test, but be careful. So then we move on to other tests.
Small question regarding the covered saccades.
Yeah.
How common some people have covered saccades and other overt saccades? Is it like also a form of compensation that people who are less well compensated do not have covered saccades? Or?
Yeah, the interpretation is that covered saccades are an indicator when they are doing things, an indicator of a good adaptation and compensation. Because then, after the head movement, you are really on target. That's the interpretation. But there's a lot of research done in understanding all the mechanisms behind that. David C., one of the most nicest, knowledgeable neurologists in the world of oculomotor from Johns Hopkins, he says the saccades are the repair kit of the brain to make sure that everything works properly. So, to the chair. The chair is a simple thing, and you can have a nice electrical chair, as you will see this afternoon, but you can also use your examination chair to move it. And then you can look if in the dark there is a vascular occult reflex. So this indicates that at least there is some vascular function. It's not one. And if you do that in a patient without vascular function, you don't see any eye movement. Now here you can use, of course, a chair to do the same thing. The chair that you will see this afternoon, this is a very powerful chair, can go in centrifugation and things like that. So it's fantastic. And I was always the victim of all kinds of new experiments. So I've been rotating 400 or 500 degrees per second, suddenly stop in the other direction. So, and then you can measure the eye movements. Here you can see with the EOG, and we measure the eye movements. Okay. Now, not everybody has an active chair, and especially in children, it's a very useful test. So you make a rotation, and if you get the cupola that deflects, and you get a stimulation, and the eyes of the baby starts to move. So it's very simple. And in this baby, you can see that there is a functioning vestibular labyrinth. You don't know whether there are two working, it's going to be still one. You don't know whether it's a little bit suppressed, but it is here. And this is so much function already that you cannot explain motoric retardation in this child by a vestibular deficit. It's too good to explain a motoric deficit. So that's why you can do that as a screening test. And then you have the caloric stimulation, which became a little bit, less popular because people were saying that this is a terrible test because you get this warm water in your ear, and you get nausea, and oh my God, people start vomiting. Well, if you take the right precautions, if you inform the patient in the right way, you never get nausea or things like that. We do it all the time. It's a standard test in our repertoire. It's a very sensitive, very good test for the horizontal canals. And there are patients that have a normal head impulse test and an abnormal caloric test. I'm not going into the details, but so you cannot replace them. They are complementary tests. So to say you don't need the calorics is a fundamental mistake. Without going into the details, there's a whole mechanism that has been investigated in time, especially when they found out that the caloric test was also working in microgravity in space. So the whole explanation by gravity acting upon the endolymph could not hold in the situation of microgravity, but there are not a lot of publications, and if you're interested in it, you just ask me and I can explain it to you. So in the caloric test, you evaluate the nystagmus, the velocity of the slow phase velocity, and in time it increases while you are irrigating the patient with warm water or cold water that heats up the temporal bone or cool it down. By that, you get a fluid that starts to move, the endolymph that starts to move a little bit and acts as a pressure upon the cupola, and you get a response. And when the temperature is warm, then the nystagmus that you will see will beat towards the investigated ear. And when you do it with cold, it goes in the other direction, because then the fluid goes down. So the whole mechanism behind it, and by that you can compare the activity of the right and the left labyrinth. This is one of the few, is not the only test that really evaluates the function of one canal. The head impulse test tests in fact both canals. Both canals are stimulated, but if you make your movement very fast, you predominantly stimulate the ipsilateral labyrinth canals and less the other one. So the faster you move, the more selective you are in which labyrinth you're testing. But it's never 100%. And the calorics is 100%. Okay, so and then you compare the responses from the calorics on the right and on the left. So in time, you see that there's an increase of the nystagmus and it fades out in time. And here in the same way, in the other side, and you compare the maximum responses in time, and then you know the difference in sensitivity of the right and the left. So this is a very good test. Takes time. Here you see a typical example of a patient who has an impaired function on one side and a normal function on the other side. Sensitivity is not fantastic because you see that the normative data are pretty wide. So it means that you can lose already quite some function before you detect it. Nothing is perfect. Now, if you put all the tests together, very simple, you start with the clinical head impulse test. If you see that it's abnormal, okay, you know enough. If it's normal, you have to check that with the video head impulse test, because in many patients, you cannot see the eye movements very well during the head movement, so you will not see the covered saccades. And that's why you use the video head impulse test. And then you can see the abnormality. If the video head impulse test is normal, then you still have to do the calorics. And even if the calorics is normal, it doesn't mean that you have 100% sensitivity. So only when you find a positive result, there's a deficit, you know for sure that there's something wrong. So we can also measure dynamic visual acuity. That means that you use your vestibular ocular reflex to have a perfect vision when you start walking, so that the image is stabilized. So you can do that in different ways, and I think we started to do that with my treadmill. We displaced it from my home to the clinic, and the people are looking at the letters first when they stand still, and then while they start to move 2, 4, and 6 kilometers. And if you look at a population of healthy people, there's hardly any decay in the visual acuity with increasing speed. At 6 kilometers per hour, it's more difficult to see small details. But if you look at patients with different grades of vasculopathy, you see that already at 2 kilometers per hour, they have a decrease compared to the normals with their visual acuity. And that increases with speed, of course. So this is showing that the vestibular ocular reflex here is and doesn't help to remain stabilized images. This is an experiment done by Niels Guinan van den Berg, where they have patients implanted with a vestibular implant. So this is the normalized static 1. Then the patient starts to walk. There's a huge decrease of visual acuity. Put the vestibular implant on, you see almost complete restorage. And then you put a sham on and it does. In the clinic, of course, many don't people have a treadmill. So how are they doing it? They ask a patient to look at this letter chart. I ask them to close the eyes. Then I start shaking. And then I ask them to open the eyes while they are shaking and see which lines they can still read. And then I stop with shaking and ask which line can you read. So have a difference between the dynamic and the visual acuity. And if they lose 3 lines or more, then it is an indicator for vascular loss. But that's the poor man's dynamic visual acuity test. Battery is running low. It's okay, I have everything installed for that. You have it? Yeah. So, so there's a specific paradigm that you can use here. So now vascular evoked myogenic potentials. There was a desperate challenge to try to find out how can we measure utricular and saccular function. I'm not going to bore you to death with all the attempts that have been done. So we have built a linear slat for that, especially where we can accelerate people up to 3G and then measure whether there is a possibility to measure the effect of utricular stimulation or saccular stimulation upon eye movements, etc. The responses are so small that you cannot use that in the clinic. Another technique is the centrifugation. You have a chair where you put a person off axis far away and you start to rotate and you get a centrifugal force. We go up to 400 degrees per second, so it's very nice. But you don't notice that in the beginning because you slowly increase velocity and you only feel accelerations. The only thing that you feel is that you're tilted, whereas you're not tilted. And as a consequence, your eyes will rotate in the opposite direction. and the eye rotation can be used then as a measure for utricular function. But again, the eye torsion is so small that you can hardly use that for clinical purposes. And these chairs cost 350,000 euros. So we have them, of course, but not everybody can afford that. And it's not a very easy test. So it will not be the usual standard utricular test. All these attempts have been tried until at a certain moment, vessel-evoked myogenic potentials were discovered. Already in 1966, they found out that with loud sounds, you could generate eye movements and head movements. Okay. The idea behind it is to speed up a little bit, so that you have a typical test that one way or the other, via the loud sound, stimulates the hair cells or the system, the utricular cell that generates these eye and head movements. There are two types. You have the C vamp, the cervical vamps, and you have the O vamp. In fact, the cervical vamps activate the vestibular collar reflex, so that when you are moving, that you stabilize your head. So via the succulus, it stimulates those neck muscles. If you contract the neck muscle and you give a loud sound, then this aspecific stimulus will lead to a change of the activity in the muscle. And you measure the change in activity. Similarly, the same sound activates also the succulus. And via another pathway, it makes sure that the eyes start to move. And that's the ocular vamp. Because the eye movements and neck movements are so small, you can better detect the change in the muscle activity than in the movement, eye movement or head movement. So that's why people measure the muscle activity, and there are all kinds of issues there, of course. So what you can see here is that you have this loud sound, and you get a typical pattern of muscle activity and deactivity. And this is the tonic level of the muscle activity. If there is no contraction, so if I just do it like this, you see nothing. If I contract my muscle, ipsilateral, you see a strong contraction on the ipsilateral contracted muscle. You see a change. That's a problem, because how to standardize the muscle contraction? And also some people have more muscles than other people. So standardization is not easy, especially when you talk about elderly. They have a muscle atrophy. So it's very difficult to measure vamps. Ocular vamps have other issues. I'm not going into all the details, but it works in a similar way. You ask the people to look up so that they contract the eye muscles, and you see a change of the muscle contraction by a loud sound. Loud sound, like I explained in my first lecture, is, yes, a stimulus for the striatal hair cells, but it doesn't make the membrane move. So the vamp is not a very typical test for measuring the integrity of the otolith system. It's a measurement of the integrity of hair cells that are in the utricular and sucker state. So I'll speed up a little bit because I explained that before. So also when you go into research, it's very much the question if the loud sound only stimulates the utriculus and succulus. Most likely it also stimulates the hair cells in the pupil. We're publishing a paper about that. No. So now, as I told you, alternatives are, centrifugation, off vertical axis, linear acceleration. These are all recurrent here in Maastricht, so people were very jealous that we had all these machines to do this. But the outcome is very negative. The outcome is not very useful. So, okay, are there alternatives? Yes, you can measure the subjective visual vertical. This is Michael Stroop showing the bucket test, where he asks a person to indicate when he holds the bucket with a line inside in the right way. So how is your orientation ability to a vertical line? This is a nice test. This is related to ventricular function and central function. The problem is that if you have acute loss, you have an acute deflection of the subjective visual vertical. But in time, it very fast compensates, so it normalizes. And the only patients where it is abnormal at the long term are people with central disorders. So there's a whole list of how sensitive it is. So this is a nice test initially, but if you have a chronic patient, very much the doubt if you can find the abnormality. You see here a whole list of possible causes of deficits. Now, a test that I evaluated also many years ago as a possibility, a simple thing, lateral flexion. So what you do is you tilt your head like this, and then during the movement, you stimulate your vertical canals. So you see a rotatory nystagmus, and you head like that. And what we see is that your eyes are maintained in the opposite direction. So the ocular counterrolling that you see, the rotation, can be used as a measure for vertical and stability function. Okay. So we developed the first real-time video eye tracker in the world. I was very proud. I presented that in the Braille Society. Everybody, wow, oh, fantastic. And then I started to make a list of all the problems that are still there. And then some people, I don't say their name, they say, oh, we solved all those problems. Now we are 30 years, 40 years further, none of these problems have been solved. So it is not easy, it's difficult. But we have an eye tracker that can do it in specific conditions. And under these specific conditions, you can what is happening. Here you can see the result, the head movement, and here the eye movement. So you see the nystagmus that is from the vertical canals, and then the utriculus makes sure that this head tilt is still registered. You see change of the eye orientation. And when you go back, you have again vertical canals that brings the eye in the right position again. So you can measure this as a measure for utricular and subcular function. It was reinvented in 2017. That's what I told you. Sometimes something has been done and concluded, and then later on people say, this is a good idea, I'm going to do this. And then they find out the same things. And the problem is that there's too much overlap between healthy people and patients with vascular deficit. But maybe still this is an option that we can explore more. And now the industry is focusing on it as a possible test for stability function. Whether that is true, I'm not sure. So we were searching all the time for techniques to improve our diagnostics. And one of the obvious challenges is, can you measure the thresholds of the vascular system, like in audiometry, like in visual perception? So then we sold more or less the linear accelerator, and we got money to buy this platform. This was negotiating because we were negotiating about the current system, which was a huge amount of money. And then we said to the company who also delivered this kind of smaller platforms, okay, we will buy with you if you give us this platform, not for free, but with a great reduction. And of course, in the tender, they gave this to us. So, it was still 100,000 euros, something like that. That was much less than they ordered. It's a hydraulic platform, so it can move very smooth without vibrations, etc. And what you basically do is you make all kinds of movements, as you can see here, in all dimensions, so translation, rotations, and slowly you increase and decrease the acceleration of the movement, and you ask the patient to indicate what is happening. So we don't tell the patient it's a rotation or whatever, it's completely doesn't know anything. Problem is, of course, that somatosenses contribute. You cannot take away somatosenses. So it's not really the threshold of the vascular system. It's more the threshold of the whole system to detect motion and orientation. But that is in daily practice also what happens. And then the key question is, can we indeed get these thresholds? So this is how it really goes. So sitting on the platform, and as I told you, I'm always one of the first victims. So, and then they make this movement, and I have to indicate what is happening. So at a certain moment, I will say, yes, I feel that. And then you have the translation for rightwards, and you go up and down, like with audiometry. So increase, where's the threshold? You go down, where's it down? Then if you pass the threshold a few times, you know, there is the threshold. Okay, then you get all the. This is one example where you can see in healthy people the translations. You see the very sensitive, very small translations that can be detected. And in bilateral vascular loss, you see that they're a much higher threshold, but there's a lot of variation. That has to do with your definition of what is a bilateral vascular loss, because generally these patients are selected based upon their caloric dose test and rotation share, which is canal tests. So that's always a difficult discussion. When are you talking about bilateral vascular loss? Which part of the labyrinth has to be affected? And if you go for the selection of rotation, yeah, because they are selected on the caloric test and the horizontal canals, you can imagine that the difference between the patients and the healthies is much bigger for the rotations. They are extremely sensitive. And here you have patients that are still pretty okay. You see there is a big range. But the first time that I started to do these kind of tests on the linear slab, I think it was 20 years ago, I showed the videos with bilateral vascular patients, and I told the people, can you imagine this person is going forward and backward, etc., and he has no idea what's going on. So because there was a lot of criticism, yeah, but you can feel it with somatosenses. Say, yeah, well, apparently, despite that, this patient is accelerating, and you ask him what is happening, but nothing. How is it possible? So this tells you a little bit how severe the depression of the function is in some patients, not in all patients, of course. So then you have a whole list of laboratory tests. I didn't tell you everything, of course, there's much more, but it gives you an overview, and that's when you go to a laboratory, it's off just in a moment, then you see all the equipment, and you can imagine a little bit how we try to get hold of vascular function. It's far from perfect, but I think we do our best to really monitor and define the function of the labyrinth as good as possible. I show to you many issues that are with different tests. So if people say, yeah, I can do that with simplification. Okay. I'm not so sure that it's really so sensitive and specific as people sometimes want you to believe. But we're still moving on in research too. Any more questions?